gentlemen, we are blessed to have with us some people who survived the darkest hours in history. And it's always important to hear what they have to say. So ladies and gentlemen, the next speaker is Agnes Grunwald-Spier, MBE. She was born in Budapest. She spent her first years in a ghetto, and then she found refuge here in Britain. And when we consider the power of words and the power of politics to change societies, we don't have to make the immediate comparison. But I think it is important to hear what she has to say. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Agnes Grunwald-Spier.
And I've got my bottle of water. I have got the most terrible, disgusting cough, but hopefully I shall get through it all right. I've come today because I just think this is so important, and I will run through my script. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an anti-Nazi German theologian who was hanged by the Nazis in 1945. Can you hear me all right? He wrote...
Thank you.
Is that better? Yeah. I can't read my script then. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. I think we all know who that applies to today. There's nothing like knowing that someone wanted to kill you when you were a tiny baby for making you appreciate the joys of life. But it comes with what is known as survivor's guilt. Why me? Why did I survive when so many others did not? Why was I chosen to survive out of the millions that didn't? Was it to do the work I do now, so late in life? When I first started speaking about the Holocaust, I was very conscious of speaking for all those millions, including the 1.5 million Jews murdered, Jewish children murdered by the Nazis, simply because they were Jewish, and I was nearly one of them. I was born in Budapest in July 1944 into a Hungarian Jewish family. My father, Philip Grunwald, was taken away for forced labour by the Hungarian fascists. That's very important. Hungary wasn't occupied by the Germans until March 1944, but he was taken away by the Hungarian fascists for forced labour in 1943. He came back very embittered. He was lucky to survive because they had a truly dreadful time. But he wouldn't have any more children after the war. He said it wasn't a world to bring children into. And he committed suicide in 1955 when I was 10. My maternal grandfather was Armin Klein. And when I was older, I asked my mother why they didn't leave. And she wouldn't leave without her family. And Armin Klein said, "Why should I leave my native land?" He was taken off a bus round about the time I was born, and he ended up in Auschwitz. Both my father and my grandfather were betrayed by their native land, and so we all know what we're fighting for today. From research I've done for my books, I've also discovered the World War I Iron Cross soldiers who fought for their native land and might have been given an Iron Cross, and the sports people who won Olympic medals for their country. But when the Nazis came to power, all those efforts were ignored and they were destroyed along with everybody else. My mother and I were sent to the Budapest ghetto, where we were lucky to survive the harsh conditions, and I was 6 months old and it was liberated in January 1945. My parents brought me to England in May 1947 when I was nearly 3. They brought me here from Hungary, which was then occupied by the Russians who'd liberated us. They chose England because they thought it was safe and fair. And I often wonder what they would say if they were alive to see today what is happening. I was asked to speak as a Holocaust survivor because of my experience of racism and prejudice. And we now find ourselves in a situation where what's called the longest hatred has reared its vicious head, particularly in the Labour Party. The irony of this is lost on many, but that great Labour MP, John Mann, who acts as the chair, of the all-party parliamentary group on anti-Semitism, knows better. Many years ago I heard him speak at the Board of Deputies, and he said because he represents Bassett Law, which is not exactly a centre of Jewish life, he's often asked why he's got involved with all this anti-Semitism. And what he said has stayed with me ever since. He says he remembers his grandparents in Leeds telling him that in the 1900s, when they were trying to get the Labour Party off the ground, they got contributions from the Jewish immigrants who gave them their hard-earned halfpennies and pennies to help get the Labour Party off the ground. And that is why John Mann is today such a great supporter of the fight against anti-Semitism. And whilst we're criticising the Labour Party, we should remember John Mann, because as far as I'm concerned, he is one of the good guys. In May 2016, he wrote in the Jewish Chronicle, "If Labour cannot combat racism, then we are nothing. And racism also always includes anti-Semitism. If we cannot do that now, then we have no reason to exist." Yet here we are, 2 years on. The number of cases of party members accused of anti-Semitism is ever rising. Ken Livingstone has been suspended since April 2016. We are told that there is a process, but there is very little evidence of this. And again, the words of Bonhoeffer come to mind. Not to act is to act. And last week we saw 2 unedifying incidents, and I'm sorry to repeat what other people have said, but we didn't have any collaboration on this. The poor MP Thangam Debonair was brought to a kangaroo court, where I believe the chair of the meeting refused to allow her to speak in her defence. And what was her crime? She was hounded by her constituencies just for attending last week's rally against anti-Semitism. And then Corbyn attended the 3 Seder at Judas, the 3rd Seder at Judas. Rabbi Laura Jana Klausner had the sense to leave when she saw he was there. But he stayed for 4 hours. And he sat there whilst they swore about the Queen. I'm not going to repeat the language. And Prince Philip. They attacked Parliament and capitalism and the State of Israel. How disgusting that words like that are used in the context of a religious ceremony beloved of Jews for centuries. And Corbyn just sat there. And let me remind you that this chief guest was no ordinary personage. He is the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition. He is called the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn. He should not have sat there while that behaviour was going on. Any decent man, any right honourable man would have got up and left.
Corbyn out, Corbyn out, Corbyn out, Corbyn out.
Now stop! I'm only meant to speak for 10 minutes, you'll get me into trouble. So, Edmund Burke said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, and the not so good do nothing as well. In the attacks on Jews, some people go to very elaborate lengths to differentiate between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Oh no, excuse me? Well, if you stop, I'll get on with it and say that. It displays a misunderstanding of what Zionism is. It was Theodor Herzl, who was a lawyer in Vienna, who was a journalist at the notorious Dreyfus trial in 1895, and he realised the anti-Semitism that broke out over the court-martial of Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish army officer and was falsely accused of espionage and banished to an island prison. He was divested of his rank in a public humiliating ceremony in January 1895, and the mob shouted, "Death to the Jews." Émile Zola, who was the most famous French writer at the time, wrote a letter on the front page of a national newspaper entitled "J'accuse." He accused the government of France for what had happened. And Herzl, from that moment, felt that Jews would never be accepted in a country that wasn't their own. And he started Zionism, and he held the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. Zionism has become a word of abuse, as we all know. And I think people don't understand that what it means is the recognition of Jews' rights to their own homeland. This is a problem for Corbyn. And yesterday, when he had the audacity to complain about Israel's defence of its borders, when attacked by Hamas, but of course they are his friends. And I would just like to say that if Israel had existed in the 1930s, there would have been no Holocaust, because the Jews would have had somewhere to go. Before I finish, I'm just going to tell you that I'm a great tweeter. You can follow me on @Grunwald-Spier, and my laptop has been red hot this week. But what I want to say is that I have been so gratified by the many messages of support that I've received from non-Jewish people. It's been quite remarkable. In the past, I've had terrible abuse. I don't seem to have had terrible abuse this time, but I've had some lovely messages. And I don't know whether he's here, and I can't find the tweet because I've had so many, but in particular, the lovely man who told me not to worry because angels would sit on my shoulder to protect me. So I'm Elie Wiesel said that the Holocaust occurred because of indifference. People were indifferent to the fate of the Jews. And at a lecture in the White House when Clinton was president, Wiesel spoke in 1991 as part of a series of Millennium Lectures. And what he said was this: in a way, to be indifferent to suffering is what makes the human being inhuman. Indifference, after all, is more dangerous than anger and hatred. Anger can at times be creative. One writes a great poem, a great sympathy. One does something special for the sake of humanity because one is angry at the injustice that one witnesses. But indifference is never creative. Even hatred at times may elicit a response. You fight it, you denounce it, you disarm it. Indifference elicits no response. Indifference is not a response. So remember Elie Wiesel and remember Bonhoeffer. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And I ask you to join with me today and, using the words of Zola, say to Jeremy Corbyn, J'accuse! Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agnes.